Uh, please continue to enjoy your meal. We can do this in Southern and I would say international style by being loose about this, but we will continue the program because of wanting to get in all that we have in the afternoon, which is a very full one. So please enjoy your lunch, and we will continue with the program. It is a great thing to have many of you involved, all of you involved from all the organizations. One of the things that surprised many people, and even, I will admit, surprised me at first, is the deep engagement of UPS in this space. People are not aware of all the engagements in the United Nations Food Program, the World Food Program, the logistics for care, and many other engagements that UPS is involved in through not only UPS operational side, but also the UPS Foundation. And Ed Martinez, as president of the UPS Foundation, is also here, and glad to recognize him. But grateful for UPS, the great support of this engagement. As I said earlier, and I wanted to say one more time to thank these sponsors, because the Coca-Cola Company and AGCO and UPS and our friends in the Poultry Development Foundation and all of the great work that they're doing, and the other sponsors, Georgia State, Robinson College of Business, and so forth, that all of these sponsors mean that we can have practitioners and students and academics and all of us here in the room in this way as their guests, if that's the right way to put it, and we're grateful for that support to make you be here. Without any more comments from me, except to say thanks to UPS and all the sponsors again and all the people who are involved. As we have a great tradition in the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, I won't lay this on other organizations, but we always have me to introduce the introducer. So we're following a pattern here, but it is my pleasure to introduce the person who will introduce the keynote speaker for today, and that's the president of UPS International, Jim Barber.
Well, at least I know it's tradition to introduce the introducer, so that's good. So, listen, I appreciate the attention. Usually the slot after lunch is toughest, but this in the middle, we'll work through this. It'll be just fine. First of all, I am very, very pleased to be able to introduce today's keynote speaker, John Rice. John is the Vice Chairman of GE and CEO of GE Global Growth and Operations. GE believes, as a growing number of multinationals do, that Africa is the most important strategically in the 21st century from a continent perspective. And based on that specific belief, it has entrusted one of its most respected executives as the point person there. John lives in Hong Kong, but travels frequently to Africa. In fact, he's just coming back from trips to Nigeria, South Africa, and Ghana. In Africa, he works closely with governmental officials and leaders to understand the needs of the continent and ways multinationals can play meaningful roles. John began his career at GE in 1978. He's held leadership positions with the company in the US, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Canada. Prior to his current role, John was Vice Chairman of GE and President and CEO of GE Technology Infrastructure. He has also served as Vice Chairman of GE's Industrial and Infrastructure Businesses, as President and CEO of GE Energy, and as President and CEO of GE Transportation. John holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics from Hamilton College in Clinton, New York, where he serves on the Board of Trustees. John has some strong Atlanta connections. He's a trustee of Emory University and serves on the board of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Foundation. He also serves on several other boards, including the International Advisory Board of the King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals in Saudi Arabia. John's a frequent speaker at leading economic, business, and industry events around the world, and he offers his insights as a commentator in a wide range of media. I'm thrilled to have the honor to introduce John today because I have tremendous respect for him and for the work GE is doing in Africa. As I've gotten to know John, it's been interesting to see our personal paths cross. I've developed a keen interest for Africa during my 12 years managing Europe, Middle East, and Africa for UPS. I now sponsor our African Leadership Foundation, which funds scholarships for African students to attend universities in the U.S. And like John, I'm helping my company chart its African strategy. I can tell you that our companies have very similar visions. I value his friendship, and he's always informed and experienced opinions on issues that matter to companies like GE and UPS and others represented here today. So why Africa? Why now? Those are very good questions for all of us to consider. And with that, I'm delighted to personally hear from someone with so much to share on the subject. Ladies and gentlemen, John Rice.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks a lot. It's always nice to be introduced by a friend. I see Jim in 3 or 4 countries around the world every year. Like he does, I travel a lot. I probably get to 40 or 50, and he's one of the few people that doesn't feel sorry for me when I say that. But I'm honored to be with you, and it's a pleasure to be back in Atlanta, which I still consider my home, although I've lived in Hong Kong for almost 4 years now. And I did visit 3 countries in Africa several weeks ago, so I have a few things on my mind that I want to share with you. But I thought first I would put this in a global perspective, because I think it's what we're going through as a company, GE, is similar to what other big global companies are working their way through. When you think about a world in which you are active, in our case, in 170 countries, and it's a world that needs infrastructure, and we have infrastructure businesses between power generation and healthcare and transportation, rail and aviation support that we provide for the oil and gas industry. It's about $100 billion of revenue for us every year. So it matters a lot to our company and our shareholders, and we look at this world that has somewhere between 1.5 billion and 2 billion people that lack very basic things. We've been talking about that last night and all of this morning. So we're in 170 countries, including about 25 of the 54 in Africa, and we're working our way into the others. If you dial back 10 years ago, 70% of our revenue came from the United States and 30% from outside the United States. Today, it's almost inverse. 60% outside the U.S., 40% in the U.S., and as you might guess, most of the stuff outside the U.S. is growing at a faster rate than our revenue in the U.S., so we expect that ratio to continue to change. The World Economic Forum does a global competitive index, and they rank 150 countries in terms of global competitiveness, which is a proxy for degree of difficulty in doing business. And last year, we had $10 billion in revenue from the toughest group of these countries. So we have to go everywhere and be everywhere in order to do our jobs. And the company I work for today is fundamentally different than the company I started with in 1978 when I was 10 years old. It is, back then, global business was a drop-in business. You could fly in, write your orders, book your deals, leave, ship in whatever gas turbine or jet engine or piece of healthcare equipment that you sold, get paid and export the profits to shareholders in some other place. And that's pretty much the way it worked in the 70s and 80s and probably part of the 90s. But it's fundamentally different today. Back then, you could have a global one-size-fits-all strategy. You could design healthcare equipment for the United States or Western Europe, and then at some point figure out that how to squeeze a little cost out of it so that you might be able to sell it somewhere on the continent of Africa or one of the countries of Southeast Asia. That just doesn't work in today's world. And it was a world where you could just say, here's your equipment, now go make it work, versus today's world where you're training, you're developing, and you're creating capacity. Because every one of those 170 countries that we do business in now expects us to be an investor. The days are over when you fly in, do your thing, and leave. You have to be on the ground with real people, doing real things, creating real value. And if you don't do that, you are not going to be part of this global framework. So the challenge for a company like ours, and I would submit many companies that do things similar to what we do, is to balance these global strengths around technology, around human capital development, the kind of things that we and the good companies in this room have been working on most of our lives. These global strengths which have scale and leverage, and make them local everywhere they need to be local. And that is, to the point of the panels this morning, a lot of discussion about, we talk about Africa like it's some homogeneous something. It's a continent, but there's a lot of difference in every single country, and I don't need to be telling this group that for sure. So our job is to figure out how to bring these global strengths to bear and make them local in fit, feel, and finish everywhere they need to be local. And increasingly, being local is not just being in Nairobi or Lagos or Abuja or Luanda. You have to be out in the country if you're going to do your job. And that's what makes the job that we have so interesting and so challenging, because it's not one size fits all. I grew up in a company where you could show up in Delhi and Mumbai and you covered India, or Shanghai and Beijing and you covered China, or Washington and New York and you covered the United States. Well, that just doesn't work anymore, and it's not the program that we can run. The last 10 years, and I'll have a few statistics on GE in Africa, but this is not a commercial for GE in Africa, because we're a long way from declaring victory. We've made a ton of progress. Just in the last 10 years, we've more than doubled the number of employees. We've got almost 2,500 people on the continent. Our senior team there is much bigger than it was just a few years ago. We're investing through our GE Foundation in 10 years, almost $100 million to help rural health care in a bunch of different areas, 136 different clinics, and we're trying to do our part. But like I said, this is not an advertisement for GE. We've just added, though, we put all this equipment in, and we realized, we don't have enough people around to maintain it and keep it working. So we went back 2 or 3 years after the equipment went in and realized we had to put a much more rigorous, sophisticated training and development process in. So we just announced a couple weeks ago another $2.5 million to train biomedical technical engineers so that they can take care of the equipment. We've also partnered with Kenya, the Commercial Bank of Kenya and USAID, to provide financing for small and mid-sized physician practices, clinics, diagnostic clinics, because we think that's something that we can do and make a difference in, and it will be scalable. And we're working with ministries of health in a number of countries to try to figure out what role we can play. Sometimes it's through our healthcare business, and sometimes it's through the GE Foundation to sort through a wide range of issues, focusing mostly, or a lot, not mostly, but a lot around education, training, and maternal and infant health care. We're convinced that it is possible to make a difference in Africa. We are absolutely convinced about that. But we also believe some of the points that were made earlier today around the importance of doing it now. You know, you have a bunch of people on the continent of Africa that expect to be in the middle class someday. And today they're a long way from it. And social media and other forms of communication give them the ability to compare and contrast and debate and provoke in ways that never existed before. You can see a picture of the skyline, the poorest section of any city in Africa, and you see low-end, low-scale living with digital satellite dishes on every roof. So these people have taken what little disposable income they have and invested it in a form of communication. Cell phone technology, internet cafes, wherever you go, people are finding a way to stay connected. That puts incredible pressure on governments who have to make significant trade-offs. I don't think there's anybody in this room that thinks that the governments of the countries in Africa don't understand how important healthcare is. But when they're fashioning their budgets, they also have to think about all the other things that they're short of. And the trade-offs that they have to make are excruciating, and some of them make it better than others. I was in Abuja last week for the or 2 weeks ago for the World Economic Forum, and throughout the discussion that took place there was a lot of debate, a lot of provocation, and some very interesting points about a broad range of subjects. But three words, that came up almost in every discussion around Africa and the individual countries in Africa was this quest for sustainable, inclusive growth. There has to be growth, or it can't be sustainable. If it's not inclusive, what happens? You get the Arab Spring, you get Occupy Wall Street, you get transition and turmoil. So everybody's after this aspiration to have growth that's sustainable and inclusive. What does that mean, and how do you get it? Well, I think you can complicate it if you want, but you don't really have to. First of all, if you're not creating jobs, you're going to do nothing that's sustainable. In Nigeria, they have 10 million youth that are unemployed. If they don't find jobs for those 10 million kids, it's going to be really hard to do stuff that's sustainable and inclusive. You have to have, and this is a transfer function, the output is sustainable, inclusive growth. Jobs, one of the inputs. Financial capital and human capital. Without financial capital, public and private, without human capital, you're not going to create jobs and you're not going to have sustainable and inclusive growth. Precedent to that, electricity, clean water, healthcare, and food. I think that healthcare is one of the critical ingredients. If you think about this transfer function that results in sustainable and inclusive growth, you got to have electricity, not very much. Imagine a middle class with no electricity. Kind of can't get there, can you? And I didn't come here to sell you a gas turbine, but I'd be happy to. But you have to have electricity, you have to have clean water, you have to feed people, and you have to keep them healthy. Or you can't do anything else that leads to sustainable, inclusive growth. If you don't do those things, all bets are off. And so we think there's a relatively few steps, somewhat simple but not easy to do, for the process by which you move forward from here. Open and transparent governance processes. And I agree with some of the comments that were made before that you're never going to eradicate corruption from anywhere. But you have to have governments that are willing to make decisions. You will not have electricity if the investors in that power generation project don't have a predictable source of fuel at some price that they can count on, and a way to sell their electricity, right? If you don't have those two basic things, you can talk all you want about public-private partnerships to do this and that, but the private part ain't coming, right? Input and output. A few basic things. You got to have governments that are willing to make decisions. You have to have bureaucracies that'll take risks. And I also agree with a point that was made earlier this morning about how we can help these governments take some risks. We can help the public sector take risks. Because if you think about it, and you're in a bureaucracy, and pick one country in Africa, and you're all familiar with many of them, what's your incentive to go fast? What's your incentive to get out a bit over your skis? What's your incentive to take a risk? None, because if you go fast, chances are somebody's going to accuse you of being corrupt, even if you're not. So it's easier just to study it for a little while longer. But that's not the way it can work. It can't work that way. And we have to help them. We have to, the private sector, the NGOs, we have to come together and teach these governments, teach these bureaucracies how they can move fast. It's not that easy, because you could argue at times the US government and governments in Western Europe don't move that fast. So this is not necessarily an easy thing to do. Consistent budgetary allocations. I was with Minister of Health in one country while I was in Africa, and he said, look, I'm never going to get enough money. I will never get all the money I need. But if I could just have a consistent percent of every year's budget that I could count on reasonably, instead of this kind of on again, off again, up and down process, my life would be a lot better, and I'd be able to do a lot better job with the money. So it's less for him about the absolute amount of money that he has to spend, and more around having an amount that he can count on from year to year. If you think about it, the projects, the programs that make the most difference are multi-year programs. So you do need to know that you're going to have funding year over year over year. Clear priorities. If you look at the countries that get the most foreign direct investment, they tend to be the countries that have the clearest set of priorities. And I'll start with one that you've all heard of, China, the 5-year plan, the 12th 5-year plan. Everybody reads them. If you do business in China and you don't read the 5-year plan, you're crazy, because they actually do what's in that document. And there are other countries too. Saudi Arabia has a Vision 2020. The UAE has something. A lot of countries are figuring out that if they set some priorities that can transcend leadership transitions, which is the hard part, they're going to get more long-term investment. And infrastructure is a long-term investment. You don't do big infrastructure projects in 2 or 3 months. And so if you have a process that is just wrapped around the next government transition and all bets are off after that, then you're going to get less foreign direct investment and you're going to have less infrastructure, because the investors are going to go someplace where they have clarity. So clear priorities that allow investors some confidence that there's a longer term play. And professional procurement practices. And I really do believe that some of the NGOs that are represented in this room and the private companies, we know how to buy stuff. We spend $40 billion a year on the kind of things that make our equipment work. And we do it fast, and we do it transparently, and we don't do it in a corrupt way. We know how to do it. The Coca-Cola company knows how to do it. IBM knows how to do it. Ford knows how to do it. Siemens, one of our big competitors, knows how to do it. Get a bunch of these companies together with a few NGOs, and let's go to work on some of the bureaucracies in the countries that want to do this so that they can learn how to buy stuff, how to tender big contracts fast. Because that's the way you're going to get these basic building blocks in place that allow you to achieve what I was talking about before, sustainable and inclusive growth. Smart partnerships and collaborations. I mean, I do think that private companies and NGOs can be even better coordinated. And that's why I think sessions like this are so great, because it gives us the opportunity to move closer to being on one page. And we'll always have to think about the GE shareholders, but we also are going to think about the citizens of Nigeria, Angola, Ghana, and South Africa. How can we collaborate in a way that's better? We can't have NGOs competing with each other. We can't have private enterprise holding their cards close to their vest because they're afraid that some big state secret is going to be divulged. If we're going to solve this problem, these set of problems, we're going to have to work differently together. And the third point I'd make is about capacity building. So the tragedy in Nigeria is a tragedy at so many levels. Those girls, it's a human tragedy for individuals, for families, and because it flies in the face of everything we're talking about today. If you don't have education, and you're not educating boys and girls, and you're not building capacity, then everything else we're talking about can't be done. Nobody wants to invest in a place where you don't have human capital that's worth investing in. So we have to educate the girls and the boys. And we have to teach them how to work. We have to give them internships. We have to show them what it's like to have a job that creates sustainable, inclusive growth. It starts with capacity building. And what Boko Haram is trying to do is make the case that you can't do that without a threat. We just can't let that happen. Because if that works, then all bets are off. Africa without capacity building is just not going to be a pretty place. You have to have it. And companies like ours and companies like yours and NGOs have to be willing to invest. It's the number one subject that we talk about whenever we talk about an investment in any country. We're building a manufacturing facility in Calabar, which is the southern part of Nigeria. It will have a world-class training facility. We're not just going to train our employees, we're going to train the employees of the small and medium-sized businesses that are going to support us in that facility. When we look at the cost of the investment that we're going to make, we add in all of the training and development, because without that, that facility won't be successful. And it's part of what the Nigerian government expects from us. That's GE in 2014, which is fundamentally different than the GE in 1978. So capacity building, I can't emphasize it enough. This combination of human capital and financial capital, and the ways you make that work, that's the art and science of what we're trying to do in the 21st century. And I believe that companies like ours are working on things like this. And when 86 years from now, when they write the stories about the best companies in this century, they're going to be writing about the companies that figured this out, that figured out how to balance scale and girth and a strong balance sheet and good technology and good human capital with the ability to be everywhere they need to be with the right fit, feel, and finish. We can't create little GEs in 170 countries, so we're not going to do that. We're going to balance and make trade-offs and leverage our scale everywhere we can, and then figure out in every single country we do business in Africa, in our healthcare business, in our aviation business, in our power generation business, what the combination is that will allow us to create the most value and have the most impact. So we all have a role in this unfinished agenda. Everybody does. There is not a world that looks good if Africa and the countries in Africa don't work. You know, I say the same thing about China. You know, this idea that we're, in the United States anyways, that we're butting heads with China is a bad idea. The world's biggest and second biggest economies have to figure it out. And number one is soon going to be number two, and number two is going to be number one. They have to figure it out. You can't have more than 1 billion people on the continent of Africa that lack as much as the people on that continent lack, and have a world that's a good place to live in. It can't happen. So the question for all of us is, what's going to be our role in fulfilling the unfinished agenda? The problems are big, but the table's big and everybody can have a seat at it. It takes a little bit of forward thinking and it takes a longer term view. These are the kind of investments, if you think about it from a company's perspective, you don't get payback. You don't get a payback in a quarter or a year. Some of this stuff is going to pay back over my lifetime. But if we're not capable of coming to grips with those decisions, then we're not going to be doing our part. And if we don't do our part, other companies probably won't do their part, and this thing will not be as successful or as meaningful as it can be. But I'm not going to go on any longer because I promised I would keep this to 15 or 20 minutes, and then we would take questions. So I want to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions you have on anything I talked about and anything I didn't talk about.
Mr. Rice, my name is Damason Fumisaka. I was born and raised in Equatorial Guinea.
What we see, I'm sorry?
I was born and raised in Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea.
Yes.
I have just concluded my graduate degree from Purdue University in International Management, and I have a bachelor degree in International Affairs from Kennesaw State University. I do have solutions to the issues in Africa, and I can help GE increase its value shares, but you would have to hire me. I'm not joking.
That's a pretty good answer. That's a pretty
I'm
good
in the
solution.
job market, so I'm pretty much available.
Well, send me your resume.
Okay, I definitely will.
We have more than a few Boilermakers in GE.
Oh, yeah. Okay. You know, one of the biggest problems we have in Africa, it's education. That's the fundamental. If you can tackle education, you can solve many other problems. Because as you already know, Africa, it's highly diverse. And within each country, there is still borders, within borders. What happened is that because of the education system we have, which is a colonial education system, we don't have the capacity to apply critical thinking of the issues that we're facing. So what happens when you go to Africa, for instance, in Equatorial Guinea, you see skyscrapers, but there is no knowledge on how to maintain them. So we're building, we don't even know how to start. At the end, you're building a castle, very empty, and you pray that it stands the next hurricane. That's Africa. Another problem is the tribal lines. We are so ignorant, respect to all my African people, but we are so ignorant that if you look at the political system in Africa, it's all based on ethnic lines. You have two candidates campaigning, and each candidate, it's working towards its own ethnic groups. So what happened is that the civilians we are so ignorant that we take it so personal, and at the end we start killing each other. My approach is create an education system from a micro perspective in which we target each country from a community perspective, educate the family, and the community will be better off. And once the community is better off, then we can talk about the country itself. Mm-hmm. It's really difficult and it's very painful because I don't know of any African country that does not possess the financial resources or the natural resources to be able to be self-sustained.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm gonna, I thought Dr. Schumer was kicking me out. So my question is, what approach does GE has in targeting the community and not the government to be able to approach, to obtain your objective? And by the way, I'm gonna ask you later on to give you my resume.
Okay. I figured you would. Well, we do actually a lot of community-based work, because you're right. I think we can do some work through the government, but we also have to be local. And so the work, community-based work, the work I referenced in Nigeria around the training and development for our facility, we've just decided to build our own ecosystem around small and medium-sized supplier development, because it's one way that you can create more sustainability around this manufacturing facility. If we just hire a bunch of people in Nigeria to turn wrenches and screwdrivers, that's not a long-term sustainable answer. And we bring everything in from some other country, have them put it together and ship it out. That's not the answer. The answer is to have as much of the supply chain come from Nigerian or regional companies as possible. So you have to qualify them, you have to train them. And so the idea that we have, which is a version of what you talked about, is to build our own training and development ecosystems so that we can demonstrate how it can be done. We'll show any other company what we're doing and demonstrate to the government what's possible. And maybe then we'll have something that's replicable and scalable.
Ginger Floyd, this is a nice segue into kind of those of us who work on the brain drain issue. GE has done some really tremendous work with its affinity groups and its African employees who are able to go back home with this special program. And so could you tell us a little bit about that and how we can build programs like that? And just an aside, we thank you from the Morehouse School of Medicine. Your GE NMF program sends our students to Africa.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Look, we are connected. We have African American Forum affinity group that works globally, and we have a women's network that works globally, and both of them are active on the continent of Africa. And they are great ways for NGOs to plug in, and institutions like Morehouse to plug into what we're doing and figure out where the synergies are. We're always looking for synergies. And we will listen to anybody and we'll talk to anybody who's got a better idea and a way for us to make 1 + 1 = 3. So it's a great way, and thank you for making that comment, to have a window into what otherwise could be a big, complicated company, because the chances are we've got a version of a lot of different things going on, and so there should be an opportunity. I would urge you to use Deb Elam, who I think you know, and her colleagues as a way in.
Mike Sage. No, go ahead. Okay, Mike Sage. Household air pollution has an exposure basically to smoke from biomass cooking has become a major issue and a contributor to the global burden of disease. Investment, we're struggling with investment in innovative household technology, and that's sustainable, looking to the future, low cost, clean, and safe. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on how to engage the business community and industry in thinking about how to invest in what's going to end up being very low-cost, sustainable technologies.
We don't do those products ourselves, but we're supporting some work in Africa with a company that does provide more environmentally responsible household cooking capabilities, because it is really important, and it's a fire hazard as well as an environmental hazard, And we think we can help, but we do that largely through the GE Foundation. And I think there are some companies out there that are developing the kind of cooking technology which really can help with that problem. Now it's a question of distribution and how do you get it to where it's needed. So we support it financially. It's not a part of the business that we're in. Yep.
Gabu Mendy. There's a lot of talk during this day today about information and how information is being collected, shared, and most important, archived. And if you look at a lot of African countries, ministries of health, most of that information is not long-term. It's usually maybe a survey. That survey is most of the time done by consultants who just come in, do the survey, go out with the data, and it's not used back in the whole country to develop the system or improve the system or, most important, make policy. GE is very much in the information business, is in the communication business. How are you working to make sure that that's become more sustainable and capacity left at the country?
Well, we're working with ministries of health, I think in 3 or 4 different countries around healthcare information-related technology. And what we've decided is you can't do it everywhere, and so we pick the places where we think the ministers of health and their bureaucracies are most receptive to working together. And so we've got 3 or 4 projects underway, because it takes a lot of different forms. It can be the kind of fundamental information that Tom Frieden was talking about this morning, vis-a-vis changing, disease rates and things like that. It can also be the kind of information that allows you to share an X-ray or an ultrasound scan from a remote location and feed it back into some city where a radiologist that's properly equipped to deal with it can deal with it. So we work on it at the device level, and also at the macro level in the countries and the ministries of health that are most interested in doing that with us.
Hi, you mentioned jobs as one of the inputs to sustainable inclusive growth. What could GE do to possibly encourage entrepreneurship for youth in Africa?
Well, actually, we're doing a couple of things, and we could do more, but one of the things we've done with the Dangote Foundation, many of you probably know that the Dangote Group is one of the largest companies in Africa, one of the largest companies in Nigeria, and one of the largest companies in Africa. And we're working with their foundation to sponsor a incentive program for people to come up with ideas that will allow us to incorporate new technology in manufacturing, and that's one area. And the other area is in more environmentally responsible solutions to power generation and things like that. So what we try to do this by organizing contests, which will incentivize young entrepreneurs to come in and show us their best ideas on a particular subject. And I mentioned a couple, but we don't have really a limit to what we can do this for. And then we give them cash grants in recognition of their good idea, and sometimes we incorporate the work in some of the stuff that we're doing. Because I think there is an enormous spirit of entrepreneurship in Africa. In the countries I visit, and a couple things. I've been going to Africa for the better part of the last 15 years on a regular basis. And every time I go, the GE people I meet and the external people I meet are better, sharper, more on their game, and it gives me great confidence. And when I see the results of these contests, I think there's no reason to think that innovation from within Africa can't be part of the way these problems get solved. So I think our role is to promote that, and where it makes sense, give it a home.
John, if we could take the last 2 questions together, you can answer
Sure. Yep.
If we start here and then go to our wonderful friend to end the questioning, and then John will wrap up. Thanks.
Hi, I just have a very specific suggestion for GE, I guess. You mentioned that GE is in the aviation business. I was curious about what aspects of the aviation business, and the reason I was curious is because in Nigeria, airplane crashes are a huge
I know that.
yeah, it's a big problem, and it's an infrastructure problem. As the gentleman before stated, we have so much technology, but not always the resources or the knowledge on how to maintain it. And so when you mentioned the aviation business, I was like, oh, aha, you know, GE can spread its tentacles into teaching the aviation business industries in Nigeria, you know, how to maintain aircrafts, like when an airplane is not eligible for use anymore. This is what you need to do, blah, 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 you know?
Especially if you fly on them, you want that.
Exactly. Exactly. But
Okay.
I was just curious about what you might be doing on that front.
Okay, I'll answer that, and I'll take this question and do both.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Isabelle Montlouis. I am a former GE employee. And so thank you for sharing some of the wonderful examples of what GE and other corporations are doing in Africa. And going back to the health agenda, you've shared some wonderful examples of building capacity and training people on the ground to maintain equipment. And much of it seemed to be related to their technical skills to address a problem, or even some of the solutions we've heard about health. But yet we've heard a lot about building capacity, building resilience, people becoming adaptive, having critical thinking, developing that capacity for the ground up, literally leadership. So my question is, what is GE, or what are other similar organizations doing to invest in building those softer skill sets so that you can actually have the foundation to build what you're looking for in the future?
Yep.
Thank you.
Well, one of the things we do a couple times a year, we'll bring 40 or 50 leaders in from African companies and countries. So we'll bring a minister or a vice minister, and we organize these groups and take them to our corporate leadership training facility in New York State. And we expose them to the same leadership training that we take our senior GE leaders through. And we value that program, they value that program. It typically is oversubscribed, so we think that that really addresses the point you're making, and we've just got to find ways to do more because there is a lot of interest in it and a growing recognition among both the companies that we work with in Africa and the countries that they need this, and they have to be willing to invest the time of the right people to go. In this case, we take them to the United States for, a week and a half or 2 weeks. So we give them the same stuff that we would give any GE employee. Aviation. We're in the jet engine business, so we build jet engines, we build avionics systems, and we lease commercial aircraft to African airlines. So the challenge with what you suggest is, you're right, but we're limited by the airline's willingness and ability to let us in. So if they don't contract with us to do the service or engage us to do the training, we have no way to do what you suggested. But many times they do. As far as the airframe itself is concerned, that work would end up being done typically by Boeing or Airbus or Embraer or one of the framers. But it's a very important issue because it takes a lot of good people working together to create airworthiness in an airliner, and we definitely have a role to play. Thank you very much.
So, John, personally for me to you, thanks. But I do want to make a point about a situation that is a walk the walk situation. The very first time John and I met in the corporate office, we talked about a number of things. We talked about his new hip, a couple other things, how well it's working. But then he moved quickly to, listen, one of the priorities I need from you at UPS is to build a supply chain for me in Africa. I need you to build one that has all the beautiful Western pieces to it, and build it for me in Africa, where it's critically important things cross borders, get to places where they should go, and get there as they're stated. For me, that's walking the walk, and John, those are the kind of situations where I like playing with certain partners in the world at UPS. So thanks so much for the talk today. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.